College. Some of you know. Welcome to this discussion of U.S.-Iran re-engagement with a question mark. I think that's going to be the point. We don't know how far it's going or where it's going. But relations between the United States and Iran were severed in 1979, before many of you here were born, and they've remained broken. Which means there's been no direct official relations between these two countries. So there's no Iranian embassy. There's an intersection. I don't know which embassy houses it, and there's no U.S. embassy in Tehran. Some of you might remember from history classes the revolution that took place in Iran in 1979, when the Shah of Iran went into exile in January, followed by the establishment of an Islamic Republic in April of the same year. And by the way, that same Shah, who was deposed in 1979, was put on the seat, but was brought back to power in 1953 after a coup engineered by the United States against a democratically elected government, but one which we sort of feared. The United States government feared. So, in November of that year, a group of, that is 1979 now, a group of Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and they held 52 diplomats hostage. After the exile, by this time exiled and the dying Shah was admitted to the United States for cancer treatment, there was a protest in Tehran against the U.S. Embassy. Who would have predicted that the hostages would remain in captivity for over 400 days? Certainly no one at ABC News, who had these newscasts they began every night with, well, this is day 292, and of course they couldn't stop once they started, so they got to, I think, 444 by the time it was all finished. So who would have predicted us as well that the relations between these two great countries would have remained strained as long as they have? It's been about 35 years now. It has been 35 years now. But we think that perhaps they're going to be taking a turn for the better. At least that's the hope. Keep your fingers crossed. An interim agreement with Iran and members of the international community was reached last November on Iran's nuclear program. That is the latest point of contention, which will be explained to you shortly. But there are many others, historical ones as well. Since then, the United States Treasury has authorized things like academic exchanges and educational services to Iran. Our guest today, to my right here, David Woodward. He's the president and CEO of Associates in Cultural Exchange. He's here to describe the evolution of that wounded relationship and to discuss in further detail the changes that are taking place. Mr. Woodward was born in Tehran, Iran, and spent his early youth in southern Iran. He's fluent in Persian, Arabic, French, and holds multiple degrees in history, linguistics, and education. He has 26 years of senior management experience in educational administration, business management, consultancy, facilitation of programs and services with clients from all major world markets in the area of language and cultural training. His experiences include, he helped to establish a master's program in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and he teaches modern Middle East history as well. He's presented extensively in forums and conferences on Middle Eastern issues, Islam, cross-cultural communication, language proficiency or language education, and international program administration. Just housekeeping here, if you've got a cell phone, be sure it's on silent or turn it off, please. In the program that you received as you entered the room, there's a comment sheet on which we invite you to give us some feedback on the program today, as well as any suggestions you have for other programs like this or different programs that you'd like us to try to organize in the future. The routine here is that David will speak for about 30 minutes, and then he will be happy to take questions from the audience that's here as well. We are recording today's program for classroom use, so when you ask a question, if you speak sort of loudly, and David, they asked if you would repeat the questions for them. And now, without any further ado, please give me assistance in giving David a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Larry, for the invitation to meet with you today. This is one of my favorite topics, talking about Iran, a place where I was born and raised. So I have a bit of a challenge because I have 12,000 years of history to cover in about 1 minute and then the rest of the talk. So we're going to get through this really quick. And then we have a little bit of a video, very late breaking news from Sunday night. How many of you saw 60 Minutes Sunday night? Great. So this will be real news to you. It's very cool. So overview, an American-Iranian journey. I like to call myself an American-Iranian as opposed to an Iranian-American. For people here in this region where I've lived for a long time now, I sound more or less like a local. Do I? Do I sound somewhat like a local Seattleite? But the way my brain is wired is quite different. اگر اینجا هر کس فارسی زبان هست اینجا یا نه? Okay, I'm just checking to see if there's anybody here who speaks Farsi. I'm not seeing any raised eyebrows. So if I switch into Farsi or Arabic, then another side of the personality comes out. As any of you who are bilingual know, your personality changes depending on which language you're speaking. And so the reality for me is that inside, I think of my home as Iran. My attitudes are therefore influenced by that, the fact that I grew up there to age 11. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Thumbnail history of Iran, facts and figures, U.S.-Iranian Cold War period, 79 to 2013, roadmap to diplomatic relations, which we're on now, critical issues, and recommended resources. This is a little bit of my family history. My mother was a Seattleite, went to Iran as a missionary in 1946 as a single woman. She went out on a 7-year term on a boat. And in those days, when you went overseas in that way, you may not ever come back. That was kind of the thinking. You went for a 7-year term, maybe you would die for illness or whatever. So it was a big deal. That's why I joke with people, hey, for you to get on a plane in Seattle, take an Emirates flight to Dubai and go shopping, I'm not impressed. Okay, that's not a big deal to me. But believe it or not, I run into a lot of people who are very nervous about going to the Middle East. They think it's somehow a really scary place. But believe me, you can get over there and back and have a great time, and it's really not that big a deal. So my parents went out 46 to 53 the first term. They were evacuated with the coup, probably 52. I may have got that number wrong. They had to spend a year abroad, and then we went back to Tehran. They were in Meshed first, which is a very religious city where my 2 sisters were born. Then they were in Tehran, the capital, 54 to 59. And then came back to the States for a year, went back to Ahwaz, which is the south. Ahwaz was the capital of the oil sector of Iran. And then my wife and I were in Kuwait 1 year, 82 to 83. I taught at Kuwait University 1 year. And then I've spent the last 20 years, 89 to 2009, helping this region engage with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which is all the Arab oil-producing countries. And we've really established between Seattle and that region very, very strong ties, kind of unique in the U.S. actually. We took a group of 84 leaders from Seattle with the Chamber of Commerce in 2009, 84, big number, and it had quite an impact over there in the relationship. And then now I'm focusing on the return to Iran. I'd like to go back after 45 years. I thought just for a little perspective, from the 11th to 5th centuries BC, the Neolithic period, these are the settlements in Iran. So this is going back a long, long way, and you have a sense of how ancient that society is. It's one of the most ancient societies in the entire world. I believe the oldest pottery in the world, 7,000 years old, is found there. I have some. It's incredible, really, how ancient this society is in the Fertile Crescent. Thumbnail history of Iran. Ancient Persian empires, 650 BC to 651 AD. 1,300 years of empire. It's a pretty long time. And it's interwoven with all of Western history as well as South Asian history, Central Asian history, African history. The Persian Empire spanned all of that and interacted with all of them. And just if you think in studying history that these societies were somehow isolated, I was reading a book on ancient Persian history, and one of the most amazing comment I've ever read in history was that they could get the mail from India to the Mediterranean Sea by horse in 2 weeks. Think about that. This is in 400 BC.
Oh, that's same as in my country, in Mongolia.
Right. So, but in our history classes, we tend to think of them as isolated. And when you think about thousands of years of people sending messages and trading, right? Millions and millions of occurrences of trade, their history is incredibly dynamic. But when I was a kid, when you study history, it was so static. You see? And that's a real problem because we don't really understand how dynamic these ancient civilizations were, particularly in that region, from all the way from Europe and Africa over to East Asia. Tons of interaction across that way. Then you get into the Arab conquest, 633 to 651. This was a massive shift in Persian civilization, which led to the Islamic Golden Era, 651 to 1219. So it's about a 600-year period there. That was sort of the highest point of Islamic history, actually, when the Islamic Empire reached all the way from India over to Europe and North Africa. And then you move into a devastating period, the Turkic conquest, where these Central Asian Turkic groups came through on horseback. They were just impossible to stop, these military on horseback. From the Mongol period, prior to that actually the Seljuk period, there was the Timurids, all the way up to 507. Then the Safavid Empire, 1502 to 1736, at the same time that the Ottoman Empire, which was primarily Turkic, was being established in Anatolia and really took over from the Byzantine Empire. So then you end up around 1600 AD with the great divide between the Turkic Ottoman Empire, Sunni, to the west, and the Safavid Shia Empire to the east, the Persian Empire. They actually changed the religion from Sunni to Shia in order to oppose the Ottoman Empire and to define the difference. And guess what the dividing line was between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire? Iraq. So if you ever wonder why Iraq has issues, that's one reason. Qajar dynasty went from 796 to 1925. That was the end of the ancient, the traditional dynasties. You move into the Pahlavi dynasty led by Shah Reza, who was a military leader who created himself a king, and then his son took over from him in 1941. We go into Islamic Republic, 1979 to the present. Okay? Facts and figures real quick. 76 million people, 2/3 under the age of 30. Ethnicities, you can see a lot. 61% Persian, although they're fairly mixed, just like Americans are fairly mixed people. Azadi, which is a Turkic group, very prominent, 16% Kurdish. And Lurs, Baluchis, Arabs, 2%. In the south, the Arabs are a very important population of Khuzestan, where I grew up. And the Arabs in the region call it Arabistan, which is a kind of a serious threat to the Iranian government. They would like to be autonomous, so there's really serious issues there. And a whole lot of other ethnicities across the board. Religious affiliations in Iran, 89% Shia, 9% Sunni. Religious affiliations of Iranian Americans. This is interesting. Look at this. The religious affiliations of Iranian Americans, from a Zogby poll a few years ago, 40% identify themselves as Muslim, as opposed to 98% in Iran. 40% no religion. 20% a bunch of other faiths. That's a huge difference in population. So if you meet an Iranian American and you assume they would be just really feel comfortable going back to Iran, that may not be the case. There are a lot of Iranians who left Iran because they were not comfortable in that society, even though they may love their homeland, right? So it's a very complex place. Economy, 1 trillion parts per parity, so 17th largest economy by that measure, 10% of the world's oil, 15% of the world's gas. Exports include cars, appliances, agricultural products, carpets. This is the neighborhood. You all pretty familiar with the map, right? What's the capital of Iran?
Tehran.
Excellent. Not everybody knows that, believe it or not. This is an interesting map. The dark green are the predominantly Shia areas. The light green are the predominantly Sunni areas. Notice it is not a clean division. This creates a lot of problems around the region. So in Saudi Arabia, in the northeastern part of Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of Shia there. Even though they are Arabic speaking, they may be more sympathetic to Iran. And that creates a suspicion within Saudi Arabia. And it can be difficult for those Shia minorities. Also in Yemen, very strong Shia population. This is an interesting map of U.S. military bases in the Middle East. If you were Iran, you might be a little paranoid, looking at where all the U.S. military bases are. This is, of course, following the revolution, because Iran itself was the primary U.S. military base up until that point. The U.S. put tons of resources into Iran militarily post-World War II. So when they lost Iran strategically, that was a massive blow. U.S.-Iranian Cold War era, I'm dating it back to the overthrow of Mossadegh, because that was the critical factor in the Iranian mentality today, of the resentment of colonialism, resentment of the West, resentment especially of the U.S. CIA-backed coup, return of the Shah, who was, by all accounts, very corrupt. His regime was very corrupt. Tons of siphoning off of oil wealth to Switzerland and so forth. 79, called the Inqilab, the revolution, departure of the Shah, American hostage crisis. Iran-Iraq war, 8 years of war, which apparently the U.S. supported Saddam in. So the Iranians felt like, you know, the U.S. was playing both sides. The U.S. had sold weapons to Iran, now was selling weapons to Saddam, Iraq, and benefiting from the war, stretching it out, prolonging it. So there's a lot of cynicism there. And I think one of the most critical moments was the downing of Iran Air Flight 655 by the USS Vincennes in July 1988, killing 290 civilians over the Gulf. Were you all aware of that? Big deal. Really big deal. That you could think of it as their 9/11, where the U.S., the great enemy, shot down a civilian airliner. And here's the thing, we never apologized, which is kind of shocking. It's a civilian airliner. We had absolutely no explanation, and we never apologized. So to me, that's a wrong that to this day needs to be righted. Somehow the U.S. needs to make amends, at least by a formal apology for killing those 290 people. Now, it may be that one of the reasons that is not happening is that following that was the Pan Am flight blown up, and many people think that Iran was somehow complicit, and that was the same year in December. So a sort of a quid pro quo potentially. We don't know for sure. First Gulf War, 1990-91, did not impact Iran that much, but the second Gulf War, 2003 to 2011, in effect opened up Iraq to Iranian influence, which seems a little odd since the U.S. rhetoric at the time was we were going in there to protect U.S. interests, but it seemed like what the U.S. actually did was defeat Saddam, open the door for Iran to have greater influence in Iraq. Seems counterintuitive, so go figure. The Iranian Green Revolution of 2009 showed that that young population in Iran is really, really unhappy with its government. Despite all the oppression and everything else, they were very, very powerful in their opposition. Now the Syrian civil war has brought both sides, in effect, to the same place. Both U.S. and Iran really need help to deal with this crisis. It's a very dangerous crisis for the whole region. Nobody knows what the solution is going to be. It's a stalemate. Molten moments, sanctions imposed by the U.S. in 79, 95, and the UN Security Council in 06, 07, 08, and 10. That latter 2010 resolution, very damaging. It has put huge restrictions on banking and on the senior members of the government doing any business. It's really hurting the government, and it's hurting the people. In 1 year, their currency lost 50% value. Obama's elected, 2012. This is something you should think about. Maybe you should look it up. 60 Minutes, 2012, March 11. Ex-chief of the Israeli Secret Service. You have to listen to this guy. His job was to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So while the president of Israel, the prime minister of Israel, was saying we should bomb Iran, we should stop them, his ex-chief of security says, in an interview with Leslie Stahl, they are rational in their own way. She asked him, are they crazy? He goes, no. They're rational in their own way of thinking. And bombing Iran now would be the stupidest thing we could ever do. I thought, well, that's interesting. You got to listen to this guy. Why is he saying that? Interestingly, in the U.S. during the election period, Evan Thomas says on Face the Nation, Obama's second term will be defined by whether he has to bomb Iran or not. And I'm watching this going, really? Is that how you define the U.S. relationship with Iran? Is whether to bomb a country? Since when did bombing become a foreign policy? I mean, are we so blasé about that, that's just what we automatically do? Oman has played a critical role. If you're really interested in this topic, look up Oman's role in the last couple of years in facilitating the negotiations between Iran and the U.S. Look, for 30 years there was zero negotiations going on. Today it's open. So this is happening and it's really important. Rouhani elected in President June 2013 was really the critical moment opening the door. Now, I've got 3 minutes, so we want to go to the video I have from CBS 60 Minutes. So this roadmap to diplomatic relations is something I put up on Facebook periodically. About once a month I update it. This starts with the phone call basically in September between Obama and Rouhani, which was the first time the head of state of these two countries had spoken since 1979. So it was a big, big deal. And as you read through this, you'll see a whole series of things that appear to have been choreographed. That's really the message of this list. From September till today, you see a steady progression of the two sides coming closer and closer together. The big issue being the nuclear discussions involving China and Russia, UK, let's see, what's the whole list here? The P5 plus 1. China, France, Germany, Russia, the UK, and the US. And they are meeting with Iran. They've been meeting in Geneva. Now they're meeting in Vienna. And this is really the summation of the whole deal. If by this summer a permanent deal is done to restrict Iran's use of nuclear technology so that it cannot be turned into weapons, then presumably the US and Iran will think about full diplomatic relations. And that seems to be where we're headed, in my opinion. But it's not going to be that easy. There are lots of forces trying to prevent this. Let's look at 60 Minutes. So I need to hit the escape button, right? All right, let's go to the 60 Minutes. This is from Sunday night. They just went to Iran, and this is really cool footage. It has not been done in 35 years.
60 Minutes Overtime.
Our pitch was basically that this is an interesting moment. All right, Rouhani's come to power. He's made overtures to the world saying, I want to improve relations. Iran has been isolated and demonized for 35 years. There's lots of bad blood for obvious reasons. Clearly, now is the time to go.
Before you left, did you know what the story was going to be about?
No, not exactly.
I think I gotta go this way. I forgot to ask her.
It's recording. We had a sense of what's going on there. The thing that you learn rather quickly in dealing with Iran and the Iranian government is that nothing really ever goes as planned.
Our flight to Tehran is gonna leave in a couple of hours. There's a lot of unknowns, to put it lightly. Basically all unknown.
Correct.
Welcome to the airport, Imam Khomeini in Tehran.
I'm James Jacoby, and I work with Michael Karzis, and we produced this piece together.
There's this.
Steve just landed, and he's in good spirits.
Iran's a place that's very hard to get into, and it's a place that I've never been. So I really, for a long time, have wanted to go to see what it was like.
Do you all speak English? Anybody speak English? Low level. Little?
No news organization recently has been on the ground, had the kind of access that Steve had, that we had, to basically just roam around.
No minders?
Not that we could tell.
What do you think of the new government?
Very well, Mr. Rouhani. You know, we're here doing a story about Rouhani, about the negotiations.
What do you think of the new president?
You asked everybody you interviewed for their thoughts on Rouhani, but you guys didn't interview Rouhani himself.
Correct.
The odd thing is, if you go to Iran to interview the president, for instance, like Mike Wallace had done, Scott Pelley had done. The protocol is you can't do anything else. You go, you interview the president, and you leave.
So you had to make a choice.
We had to make a choice, and the choice was basically, do we go do a presidential interview, or do we do something deeper, do we do something more comprehensive?
So it was an easy decision for us. Rouhani has given interviews in Farsi before. He's much more careful. We wanted to go and see the country. We wanted to be there. We wanted to talk to people and see what was going on.
This would be the stand-up location.
We've been going, just meeting and driving and meeting and driving.
We would just work in the car in traffic just so that we utilized every minute that we had, every waking minute, which was basically the whole time.
You didn't
Because we
sleep?
didn't really sleep.
Why?
There wasn't time.
He would want to do the interview. He does. Okay, was that the senior, the father?
You have only so many hours on the ground. Here's a place that you don't get to go behind the curtain that often.
You speak English?
A little? No matter what, it'll be an interesting place, right?
There's a huge middle class in Iran. It's very well educated. Literacy rates are really high. The city is extremely clean and manicured. It's a nightmare in terms of traffic.
There's a real way to cross the street there.
And stay alive?
Yeah, well,
There's the challenge.
you play chicken with every car crossing the street. I'm going to go. You're going to go. I'm going to go. You're going to go. You think you're going to go. I'm going to go. And you just literally, you step in front, and they surprisingly brake for you, but only at the last minute.
Now I'm going to die. Now I'm going to die. We're going to get Steve Coca-Cola.
Steve's reported from a lot of places, but to get on the ground in Tehran right now is a big deal for him, and I think you get back to your reporting roots. You get out there and you really ask people the same questions you'd ask of their officials.
Has anything changed much in the year since Rouhani was elected?
We talked to students from the University of Tehran. We talked to a professor there. We spoke to the chief of staff.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We spoke to an art dealer. We spoke to two very successful businessmen that have started up their own internet provider service. We spoke to people on the street. Merchants, shop owners, musicians, day laborers, moms and dads, kids.
I'm talking to these people, and they cannot believe that they're talking to Americans.
We're journalists.
You are a famous man?
Not in Iran.
What did you find when you took Steve Croft and a camera crew out on the streets of Tehran?
Can you believe this?
5 people would turn into 15 people, into 40 people, into 55 people. And then Steve would be in this scrum, and this whole group would move with him.
The Iranians feel as though they rarely get their voice heard. And so everybody in the streets wanted to congregate around Steve to just kind of talk in great granularity about the details of the nuclear deal.
Are they talking about the bomb, or are they talking about
Also saying in terms of nuclear weapons, if the U.S. has it, why we cannot have it?
Or their grievances with the U.S. support of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War.
You want to speak to us? Okay.
This guy, I think, for the first time in his life, happened upon an American. He was pretty intense.
His father has been killed in the war, Iran-Iraqi war. What he's saying is basically the U.S. was behind Iraq and supported Iraq during the war.
He really had made a point of saying, listen, I've got something to say to you. Not you, Steve Croft, but you...
America.
Yeah.
No, one last person. He's been very patient. Last person, okay? Most of these people haven't seen American journalists in more than 30 years. And I think that they really wanted to talk. It wasn't hostile.
Basically, they are saying they are friends. They feel friendship with the Americans. But the problem just is the politics.
they're in a strange way friendly towards Americans and they like the West. But they don't like the foreign policy and they don't like the what's happened over the last 35 years.
And it wasn't just men. I mean, there were women that, you know, Steve spoke with.
The place is just totally charged up. There's a palpable sense of an historic moment going on there right now. Our governments are talking officially and notably for the first time really in 35 years. And it was really exciting to people.
You explained to them, I'm not with the government, so don't blame me for the policy.
And there was this great back and forth, and it was really exhilarating, actually.
I came back more optimistic. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But it's one of those opportunities that you kind of hope is pursued to the fullest, because we've been enemies with the Iranians for a long time. I don't think that the Iranians are ready to become or want to be our friends, our best friends. But I don't think they want to be bitter enemies.
Minutes overtime.
Okay, so you can.
Was basically that this is an interesting moment.
When you go to Iran, you wear a sign that says "Man ba dolat Amerika nistam." I am not with the U.S. government. That's the sign you wear. Okay. So, yeah, just wrap up here. So real quick, and then we'll go to Q&A. Okay. So let's see. So critical issues ahead. Deadline for the deal, nuclear deal, July 20. Although that could be pushed back. End of Obama's second term, 2016. I think that's really the critical end of this period in terms of an open door. Who knows with a new president what would happen? It could all change very bad in a totally different direction. Big question we've had is will Israel attack nuclear sites in Iran? They've been threatening to for several years. I don't think that's going to happen. The Russia-Ukraine conflict could have an impact. Russia's key to this whole process, as well as China, because they are neighbors and very involved in Iran. Will the hawks in these various countries sabotage the deal? There's a lot of hawks that benefit by the enmity between the two countries, and they may lose, including in Iran, the people in the government who make a lot of money from having monopolies. And then finally, will Americans take the initiative during this window of opportunity to strengthen ties through academic exchanges, tourism, areas where sanctions are being lifted? And what I did not emphasize in the steps towards diplomacy was the huge announcement March 20, you can look it up, U.S. Treasury, authorizing academic exchanges between the U.S. and Iran. That means in international education, Larry, our institutions, our partners can now do business in Iran legally, and that's a huge deal. So the reason academic exchanges are important is that's the front of the whole process. And if that goes well, we start building trust between the two societies, and we can grow from there. Recommended links. Just to point out that in Seattle, there are tons of great resources. The interest section of Iran in DC is actually in the Pakistani embassy. Very easy to find it. We can email this out if you want the list. But Persian and Iranian Studies at UW is a really great place to start, and also the Iranian American Community Alliance, which hosts a festival June 28 at Seattle Center. So you just go to the festival Saturday, July 28, you'll see thousands of Iranian Americans and friends there, lots of great food, music, and all that, and a lot of great resources if you're really interested in following up on that. So that's the formal presentation. So any questions?
I just want to mention that this 8-minute clip that you saw there's a 15-minute story.
That's the main story, right?
And I can send you the link, or you can just go on YouTube and ask for the
CBS
60 minutes visit 8 days in Iran. Yep. It will pop up. It's a 15-minute interview.
Do you need me to stay here? Can I move out?
You can move if you want.
Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
I'm sure there's one comment what you just wrote on the whiteboard. Excellent opportunity for the T-shirt industry.
Right, right.
Also, oh yeah, so my question was about the ex-chief of Mossad saying that bombing Iran would be stupid. That's quite a bombshell. Is that indicative of a broader disconnect in the Israeli government, or was he just one guy shooting his mouth off?
No, there's been a lot. I track all this, so you'll pick up a serious dissonance internally over one side, maybe more of the hawkish side, and you never know with politics. You never know when someone says something what they really mean. You just have to remember in politics there are usually layers of meaning and layers of intent. So it may be that any country that is threatening another country, number one, you have to think about what is the domestic value. That's number one. Who is his audience? Number one, it's usually domestic. And then secondarily, it's a foreign audience. And it may be, if it's Israel, it may be the US population or the US leadership. And then maybe in addition to that, it could be a broader global population. Iran likewise. Back in the 80s, when I was a young college grad and I began doing lots of talks on the Middle East and Iran, the rhetoric coming out of Iran was something Americans were not used to. There would be rhetoric about, we will fill the Gulf with the blood of America or something like this. And Americans are like, what? What kind of weird people are these? Well, you have to translate, first of all. You have to understand a lot of this is in translation. A lot of it is hyperbole. A lot of it's poetic language. A lot of it is intentionally overstated. And the domestic population that's hearing it in their language understands that. But you translate it, and a foreign population goes, these people are sick, these people are crazy. This is... Always pay attention when someone starts calling someone in another country crazy. Pay attention to that, because that's usually an indication that they have no idea what those people are actually thinking. Anybody who starts calling someone crazy in another country usually means they do not understand that. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Can you elaborate on hawks?
Basically, it has to do with the military industry.
Right.
So in effect, whether it's the Saudis, whether it's the Israelis, the Americans, the Iranians, all of them, I mean, the military industry is a massive industry. It's in the multiple trillions of dollars in terms of the nature of that industry. You could say the same thing about the energy sector. The thing I haven't said is that all of what goes on worldwide, you have to look at what's happening to the price of oil. So anytime anything's happening, go over and look at the price of oil. And think about what is the dynamic between what this country is doing or that leader is doing and what that will do to the price of oil. Particularly if they are oil producers. Anybody who's an oil producer, including in the US today, look at what's happening in US domestic politics vis-a-vis the price of oil or price of energy. Because it tells you a lot about why people are doing what they're doing, what politics they're supporting, what politics they're against, and especially in the Middle East where half the world's oil is. So energy sector is a big one, military sector is another, and the conflicts are helpful. That's the thing that the general population often doesn't realize, is that conflicts are part of the business proposition. We need the conflicts in order to jack up the oil prices, sell weapons. That's just a very rough generalization of what I've observed over the decades.
Yes, I was wondering what Iran is doing to diversify its economy besides just focus on oil. What other aspects are they looking into expanding?
Well, this is really interesting because what's been happening in the last couple of years is a shift toward more of a service economy, tourism economy, and that's part of this sort of peace initiative, if you will, of Iran, is in fact to try to replicate what has happened in Dubai. So they actually have a place called Kish Island. It's off the coast of southern Iran. They have hotels, they have an airport. There is a proposal that we have a direct flight from New York to Kish Island, just like we now have Seattle to Dubai. So it's a way to bring foreign currency into the country. This was happening all over the world in former Soviet Union countries and so forth. You promote tourism, medical tourism, as a way to bring revenue, foreign currency, into the economy. So that's a big one, is tourism. But yeah, Iran would like to diversify, but the restrictions on banking are very severe. It's really tough, but tourism is ongoing. There's thousands of people going into Iran all the time, Americans included. Yeah.
Who are Iran's main trading partners?
China, Japan, historically, Russia. They historically routed a lot of stuff through Dubai as a re-export zone. Turkey, big one. Eastern Europe. In effect, the non-aligned countries, those that were not under the U.S. kind of control, everybody else.
I believe Turkey's a pretty big hub for moving oil from Iran over to Europe. That's a major export.
Yep. Okay. Any other final questions?
Actually, I have a question for you. Is it yesterday or the day before, there was a story in the paper I read about the Iranian Guard, what's it called?
Revolutionary
Guard, paying Afghanis $500 a month plus all expenses to go fight in Syria to support the Assad regime. Would you comment on that? It just reminds me again that there are elements within Iran that don't necessarily want to see peace break out either. So,
yeah, and I don't think anybody involved is thinking about whether peace is involved or not. I think, again, it goes back to more of a kind of business orientation. Again, conflict is part of the deal if you're running countries. You're going to have conflict. So really it's more about winners and losers. People aren't sitting around in these halls of power thinking, how can we have peace? They're thinking a lot more about who is the winner in this game, who is the loser in this game. And sadly, I'm not sure that right and wrong plays a big role in it. And I'm talking about the US government as well. I think it has a lot more to do with what is my interest, what is our interest, do we win or do we lose? Unfortunately, that's realpolitik. And if you can hire cheap mercenaries over here who don't have jobs, ship them over there to prop up a regime that has been friendly to you, why is that important? Because that's one of the routes you need to send stuff if you're going to export. You're going to try to export through Syria, or you've got an ally there to help you with your interests in that part of the region. So yeah, mercenaries are everywhere. And I would suggest that a lot of Afghanistan, it's really hard to find anybody who isn't a mercenary in a sense, I mean, in the conflict there. So when we went into Afghanistan, I had friends saying, yeah, look at, we won, and we're going to get bin Laden soon. This is 12 years ago. And I said, really? Do you have any idea where he is? And, of course, we apparently didn't. But then I asked the other question, well, what happened to the Taliban all of a sudden? And it was really sort of a matter of shaving, to sort of fit into one society or the other of the society at the time. And unfortunately here, there was really very little understanding of what the goal was going into Afghanistan. And today, still, 12 years later, 11 years later, we're still struggling with what is the goal in Afghanistan, which is a little bit upsetting to me. We've got to think more about using the military as our first line of diplomacy. We've got to think a lot. And that's why I think this opportunity with Iran is so big and so important. And by the way, I do not mean to whitewash the government in Iran. One has to deal very carefully with this government, as one does with a lot of governments. Okay? Yeah.
Where did you set up your Masters in TESOL program, and how does that play into the work that you're doing?
Well, my organization, we operate intensive English centers at universities. And so we assisted Seattle Pacific University in 1993 with establishing a Master's in TESOL there. And we have an institute there, an intensive English language institute for international students coming into Seattle Pacific. And so that way we can help by partnering with the university on having a master's program there, we could then recruit those graduates, and we have done so. So our director of the institute was a graduate of that program, as well as a lot of our senior staff. So we work with Montana State University, University of Rhode Island, St. Francis University in Western Pennsylvania, and we do capacity building. We help those institutions internationalize through bringing international students in and helping them to engage globally with partnerships around the world. Great.
You mentioned also 2016 being pivotal for Obama, but I'm wondering how that could also affect the legislative elections that will take place in 2016 in Iran with talks on nuclear.
Yeah.
Who would be sort of the big winners of those whole elections?
I can't even begin to answer that question with the last minute we have. I mean, I don't know enough about the internal Iranian legislative elections, although I will say this, that it's generally acknowledged that Khamenei, who is the religious supreme leader in Iran, is actually the one who calls the shots. So that the parliament, the president, and so forth have a kind of operational control, but they don't really have fundamentally a policy control. So really you have to go back to who the supreme leader is and whether that supreme leader, let's say a new supreme leader took power, would that supreme leader change policy direction rather than what the legislature is doing. But you can tell that the popular changes in Iran of the youth population that has shifted away from a revolutionary attitude has had a huge impact on the government in potentially destabilizing the government. And the sanctions have had a huge impact as well. So the Iranian government today is in a different position from even 3 or 4 years ago. You can tell that, yeah. Yeah.
So, do you think if the religion among these Middle Eastern countries, it wouldn't exist, or it wouldn't? Sorry, I will create again my question. So, if the religion wouldn't influence so much among these Middle Eastern countries, do you think that all these political issues would exist?
I don't see these as religious issues. By and large, even though I studied Islam and Islamics, I'm not a Muslim, but I'm very interested in Islam and I've studied it to some degree. I have never really seen the issues of the region defined by religion, although that's how the press defines the religions. To me, the conflicts have much more to do with winners and losers. Who are the wealthy? Who are the poor? Who are the people in power? Usually a very small population. Who are the people at the bottom and with no power? Usually a very large population that's less educated. You see those same demographics all over the world, and unfortunately it's starting to happen in the US. So you're seeing a bigger divide, more of an oligarchy at the top, and you're seeing the hostility coming out from sort of the bottom of society. So these are universal issues. They have very little to do, in my mind, with religion. You can substitute different religious populations, India, China, you name it, whatever the religious background, and you can find this very similar dynamics in just about any society historically. And it's fascinating because I think the press does us a disservice by putting religious labels on, good guys and bad guys. That's really a bad way to understand what's going on, dynamically in a society. So, yeah.
I'd like to follow up on that one if I could.
Yeah.
Because I understand that Saudi Arabia is predominantly Sunni religion. And Iran, of course, is predominantly Shia, and they don't get along. And you're saying that the domination of one religious variation of Islam has nothing to do with the conflict between the two of them?
Here's how I explain it. It has very little to do, fundamentally, with theology. In other words, what the people actually believe is not the reason they're having the disagreement. The label allows people to say, this is on my side, that is on the other side, and I'm going to protect my side against the other side. And so an illustration of that would be in former Yugoslavia, where you had a society for 70 years under Tito, where everybody was intermarrying and living together, and they didn't actually know what the differences were in their belief systems. But when Tito died and former Yugoslavia started breaking apart, people started to try to figure out, are you on my side or not? and they spoke exactly the same language, and for the most part, the younger generations were nominal believers in the different faiths. They didn't actually know what their differences were. They had to learn what the differences were in order to know who to kill. And that happened in Rwanda as well. And two populations in Rwanda who looked exactly the same, spoke the same language, more or less had the same beliefs, but they had two different tribal names. And they would literally have to ask, which tribe are you? So I know whether I have to kill you. So you see, the problem really goes back to human sort of tribal thinking. What is my tribe versus what is your tribe? So whenever any political leader says, you are either with us or against us, and you know who I'm talking about, I have real serious concerns about that. Because what you're really setting up there is expanding the conflict, rather than trying to find a way for everybody to work together. Yeah.
Do you think the fundamental...
Do you want to cut it off?
We're going to continue, but let me formally close the program because I think that some people have to leave for class, but I'm guessing that David will hang around for a few minutes.
Sure.
We'll keep taking questions, but for anyone who does have to leave, thank you for coming. And if you'd like to receive notifications of this sort of program or give us some feedback, there's information in the program itself for how you can do that. Let us know. We'll be happy to put you on the mailing list if you're not on there already. And let's proceed with the questions, and then I'll ask for a round of applause when we do the end. Go ahead, John.
Would you say that sort of the key element in the antagonism between the U.S. and Iran is more like old grievances? Like an Irish cousin of mine once said, the fundamental thing in Northern Ireland is, oh, you did this to us in 1921. Well, you did this to us in 1798. Do you think that's the basis of our?
I think that's an element of it, but really more fundamentally, it's really in a sense a legacy of colonialism. So you have the U.S. literally took over colonial oversight of Iran as the British Empire broke apart, and Britain had been the dominant controlling interest there, and then it ceded that control to the U.S. So when Mossadegh in 1951, who was a democratically elected prime minister, he was in the process of nationalizing the oil.
Right.
The British Petroleum, BP, same company, said no, no, no. And Britain actually threatened to militarily go into Iran right then. And the U.S. said, don't do it. We'll take care of it.
Take care of it.
And the U.S. took care of it. So Iran, I mean, these are smart people. By the way, people are smart. Pretty much worldwide, everywhere I've been, 53 countries. Everybody is really, really smart, and they're not crazy. And so Iranians know their history really well, and they still resent the U.S. overthrowing their legitimate government. Just like if the English were able to come in and overthrow George Washington's government, the American colonists would have been outraged once it was established, right? Let's say 2 years later. So it's exactly the same kind of a thing. They felt like, hey, this is our society, we should be running the show. Then you add to that what then becomes a serious estrangement, from the hostage crisis, which was clearly orchestrated by the people taking over. And then you had the downing of the civilian airliner, et cetera, and the wound gets bigger and worse and worse. But I think you have a sense the U.S. was the premier power, Iran was the sort of lackey, and Iran's going, hey, we're not going to be your lackey. We're not going to do your bidding. We're not going to do anything you want us to do. We're going to stand up for ourselves. And the U.S. didn't like that, right? They wanted a proxy.
Especially the oil companies.
Especially the oil companies. But also the military for strategic interests. The effort to contain the former Soviet Union. And still to contain Russia today. Anyway, yeah.
How does Iran people see Asians?
Well, that's a bit hard to generalize, about anybody. I don't even know how I think about all people in one society, but I think you could say Iranians are, in a general sense, Iranians are kind of in the middle of everything historically. These are people who ran a huge empire, and it's in the culture today to be very skillful in business and deal with people across the world. They have very close historical ties with China and very close historical ties with India. So you'll see it in the art, you'll see it in the miniatures, you'll see it in the carpets. A lot of cultural influences both ways. So I always say, look, China and Iran are basically cousins. I mean, they're sort of like neighbors to me. The way of thinking is very similar to me when I've been in China. So we look at it from the US side going, one is one side, one is the other. But if you're in China or Iran, they're just across the border. They're very close. So actually, these are all people who work together, and they do a lot of business together. And even toward the US, there's a wonderful, generally across Iran, there's a wonderful feeling of really liking Americans, which is surprising because if you ask the general American about Iran, it's not a good you generally don't get a positive kind of feedback about Iran.
Because they basically don't differentiate Iraq and Iran.
Well, they don't know much about it. It's far away, and we've been taught to dislike these people, and it's a lot of in a sense negative PR. So yeah.
A history question. Iran and Canada do they have diplomatic relations?
They have had diplomatic relations. I thought that at one point, do you remember, Larry, if Canada had to close their embassy at one point? They had an issue over the Canadian journalist. Remember the Canadian journalist?
Huh?
There was a Canadian journalist that was imprisoned in Iran. And that was, I believe, an Iranian-Canadian.
Well, plus the Canadians helped the 6 Americans escape.
Yeah.
If any of you have seen the movie Argo, it's a good
one of those 6 was the older brother of a friend of mine.
Seriously?
Yeah, Mark Lyjak.
Yeah. So I don't know the current status. I mean, I haven't looked it up.
I guess, could you elaborate more on what was the reaction? My question was actually about that, the rescuing of the hostages. What was the reaction to that vis-a-vis Canada?
You mean the movie Argo?
No, at the time. Did they find out? And what was the reaction?
Yeah, I think they did. I haven't really looked into it in any detail. I always differentiate between what the government's reaction was and what the typical man on the street probably wouldn't care. I don't think it was that big of a deal. You have to remember that when the U.S. and Iran broke off relations, there were millions of people affected in a very negative way. I mean, it hurt a lot of businesses. It hurt students that wanted to study in the U.S. Do you know that in the 70s, there were a couple 100,000 Iranian foreign students here? So it really left tons of people high and dry, including a number of my friends and even family members. And so it was just really hard on people. So I always differentiate between what the public statements of the government are, and the average people are like, hey, we just want to be able to go back and forth and see our family, right? We don't want to play these political games. Okay?
Can I have the last question? I don't know if it's the last question, but I heard at another speaking event about a week ago that Iran has one of the highest, I don't know if it still does or if it's in the past, what we call the brain drain. That's Iranians, when they leave Iran, they go to study at universities in the West, and they don't come back. So we call it the brain drain. And Iran has the highest rate of that. And I'm wondering why that's the case, because it is an interesting society.
Well,
is there any insight there to understand the culture?
My understanding is that about 50% of the economy is controlled by the government.
Okay.
So you've got to play by the government's rules. I'm not going into an analysis of the Iranian government. I think it's well established what the problems are. But for a bright individual who wants to be creative and have a great career, you got to play by the rules there, or you can get in big trouble. There's a limit to freedom of expression. There's all kinds of government intrusiveness, and not just Iran, in lots of places where you can't get permits. Let's say you want to run a newspaper, and then for whatever reason, you're out of favor, and a different new president comes in, they decide to crack down, they're going to be tough, and they start cracking down on all the newspapers and the book publishers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's that uncertainty. It's like that sense, if I invest my life here, how do I know in a few years, the political winds won't change, and then suddenly I'm going to...
But was that always the case?
Well,
I'm not thinking about the current government, but this phenomena of a brain drain predates this government, doesn't it? At least that's the way it was. The comment was.
It's much worse under this government.
Is it? Okay.
Much worse. Under the Shah's government, the Iranian government funded a lot of students to come to the U.S., just like the Saudi government is doing today. And the assumption then was you'd get a U.S. education, you'd go back, you'd set up your engineering firm or whatever, and you'd do very well, which is what typically would happen. And people wanted to be able to go back and forth. They didn't want to have to choose. But now that you have to choose, it's much tougher to go back and forth. You're saying, well, do I want to be stuck in this sort of constrained environment, or do I want to go somewhere where I have a lot more opportunity?
Okay, thank you, David. Will
welcome.
you please join me in giving a round of applause? And with David's permission, I will send some of this information in his slides. If you provide your email address, write it neatly on the sign-in sheets, I will get the information to you as well.
Welcome.